Welcome to CozySideAudio, where every story pulls you deeper. If you like the thrill, the mystery, and the chase, like, share, and subscribe before the next clue disappears. CozySideAudio presents The Orchard That Remembers. Chapter 1. The Orchard's Gift. Koharu had almost forgotten the way the mountains curved inward, enclosing the valley like a pair of cupped hands. From the train window, she saw the ridges rising, green and blue, their tips veiled in mist that clung stubbornly even in the warmth of late summer. Beyond them lay the orchard, and beyond that, the town where she had once been a child. When she stepped off the train at the small platform, it was the smell she noticed first. Not coal smoke, not the sharpness of iron rails or the faint tang of rain on gravel, but the familiar perfume of apples ripening somewhere out of sight. It drifted down the valley and reached her in uneven waves, as if the trees themselves were breathing. She stood still a moment, suitcase in hand, while the train clattered away, its sound diminishing into the folds of hills. The station master, an old man named Hironobu, if she remembered correctly, nodded to her without surprise. "Back home, are you?" he said, though not as a question. He looked much the same as when she had last seen him, with wiry eyebrows that seemed forever caught in some skeptical thought. She gave a polite bow, then lifted her suitcase again and began the slow walk along the road that curved toward the orchard. It had been 6 years since she last lived here. She had left for the city in pursuit of a life that, at the time, had seemed more proper. University lectures, narrow rented rooms, the faint promise of office work that her father had always insisted would mean stability. Yet she found herself now retracing her steps, not entirely sure if she had returned out of duty, defeat, or something quieter, like the tug of roots buried too deeply to sever. The road descended gently, passing terraced fields where rice bent low under its own ripeness. Children in straw hats darted between paddies, their shouts echoing across water. To the west stretched the orchard, 100 acres of trees planted in lines that bent with the slope, their branches already heavy with fruit, though the harvest was still weeks away. She could see the faint shimmer of protective nets in some sections, a precaution against crows. The orchard had always been there, older than her grandparents, older even than the town itself, if the stories were to be believed. And it was not merely an orchard. Everyone in the valley knew it, though few outside seemed to believe them. When fruit ripened here, it carried more than sweetness. To bite into it was to taste the past, not in the vague way of nostalgia, but in precise recollections, sharp as sunlight. Koharu had eaten her grandmother's plum once, when she was only 7. She remembered sitting in the shade of the porch while cicadas droned. The flesh had been tart, but then her vision blurred and she saw, clear as day, the inside of her grandmother's sewing room. Threads looped in baskets, the faint smell of mothballs, the radio humming a tune from decades earlier. She had felt her grandmother's own nimble fingers working a hem, though her own hands remained still in her lap. When the taste faded, she had wept without knowing why. Such was the orchard's gift. Each fruit held a memory, sealed within until someone chose to taste it. Sometimes it was the tree's own recollection of sun and rain. Sometimes it was a person's moment impressed upon the fruit when they ate another, the cycle endlessly entwined. No one understood the mechanism. They accepted it as part of life here, like the rhythm of seasons or the murmur of the river at night. Her family's house stood near the orchard's edge. Its tiled roof sagged more than she remembered, and weeds had climbed the stone wall. She pushed open the wooden gate and entered the garden, where the late summer flowers drooped, their petals faded. The air smelled faintly of soy sauce. Someone must have been cooking earlier. Inside, the house was dim. Her father, Takeaki, sat on the tatami mat in the main room, his posture straight despite his age. His hair had thinned, but his eyes remained sharp, dark pools that measured her before softening with recognition. "You're back," he said simply. "Yes," Koharu replied, setting her suitcase aside. He studied her another moment. "The trees will be glad." This was his way, never sentimental in words, yet always speaking as if the orchard itself were listening. Koharu bowed her head slightly. She wanted to tell him about the city, about how work interviews had left her restless, how nights were filled with neon and loneliness. But she said nothing. Instead, she asked, "How is the harvest this year?" Her father hesitated. "It will be good," he said finally, though the pause unsettled her. He turned his gaze toward the paper screen doors, beyond which the orchard waited. That evening, Koharu walked the rows. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air hummed with the quiet industry of insects. She reached for a low branch and plucked an apple, round and firm in her palm. Its skin was flushed pink. She hesitated, then bit into it. At once, warmth spread through her. She was no longer herself, but someone younger. Her own mother, standing in the orchard years before Koharu's birth. She felt the weight of a basket in her arms, heard laughter nearby, and sensed the presence of her father, younger and more carefree than the man she had greeted hours earlier. Then the vision faded, leaving only the crisp sweetness of apple on her tongue. Koharu stood still, heart beating fast. She had expected familiarity, but not this. Not her mother's memory, unspooled like thread from the core of the fruit. Her mother had been gone these past 3 years, taken swiftly by illness, and Koharu had thought she remembered her well. Yet here was something new, a piece of her mother she had never known, given through the orchard. She pressed the apple core against her lips and whispered, "Thank you." The sun slid lower, painting the mountains gold. She walked slowly back to the house, carrying the core as if it were fragile. Somewhere behind her, a branch creaked, though no wind stirred. She thought then, only for a moment, that the orchard was watching her. In the days that followed, Koharu settled into rhythms she had half forgotten. She rose early, swept the engawa, accompanied her father to inspect the trees. Villagers came and went, sometimes asking her father to select fruit for weddings or funerals. She watched a child bite into a pear and laugh suddenly at a memory not his own. An old woman cradled a persimmon before tasting it, then wept quietly as her dead husband's voice filled her mind for the briefest instant. It was all as she remembered, and yet there was a subtle wrongness. Some fruits fell too early, bruised and useless. A sourness lingered in certain bites, as though memories had spoiled. Her father avoided comment, but once, in the stillness of night, she heard him sigh heavily, as if carrying a weight he could not name. On the 4th morning after her return, Koharu walked alone to the far edge of the orchard. There, beneath a gnarled chestnut, she found fruit scattered, blackened before their time. She crouched, lifted one carefully. Its skin split at her touch, releasing a smell not of rot alone, but of something older, like pages left too long in damp air. She dropped it quickly, wiping her hand against her skirt. The orchard was changing. She could feel it, though she did not yet understand. And standing there listening to the silence press close around her, Koharu realized that coming home might not mean returning to what she had known, but stepping into something entirely new and possibly perilous. She looked up. The branches swayed, though no breeze touched her skin. Chapter 2. Whispers of Rot. The mornings grew cooler as summer loosened its hold. Mist gathered at the lower slopes of the valley and lingered well into the day, draping the orchard in gauzy silence. Koharu often woke before her father and walked among the rows, carrying a basket though she rarely filled it. She told herself it was habit, but in truth, she was searching. It began with the small things. Apples that looked perfect from afar, but when turned over, revealed blemishes hidden on their undersides. Plums soft to the touch days before their time. Pears whose skins bore tiny black freckles, as though marked by some invisible hand. Each discovery was slight, but together they whispered of something amiss. She tried to dismiss it as weather. The summer had been damp. Perhaps the rains had lingered too long. Orchards were always vulnerable to the whims of nature, her father often said. But the unease clung to her. When she carried one of the spotted apples back and sliced it open, she found the flesh marbled with browning veins. She tasted it cautiously. The flavor was not only sour, it was broken. The memory inside splintered and dissolved, offering nothing coherent. For a moment she glimpsed a shadowy image, someone's back turned, a field of reeds, a voice that cut off mid-word, and then the taste collapsed into bitterness. Koharu spat it out, heart hammering. She rinsed her mouth at the garden basin and stood there, gripping the ladle, water dripping from her chin. The orchard had never done this before. That evening, she mentioned it to her father. They were seated at the low table, their meal simple. Miso soup, rice, pickled vegetables. He listened in silence, his chopsticks poised but unmoving. "Some fruits spoil early every year," he said finally. "It is not unusual." "But this one," Koharu began, but stopped when she saw the lines tighten at the corners of his mouth. His eyes remained fixed on his bowl. After a pause, he added, "The trees know what they are doing. We mustn't rush to worry." Koharu fell silent, yet she noticed he did not look at her for the rest of the meal. In the days that followed, she began to hear murmurs from others. At the small market near the shrine, two women whispered over baskets of persimmons, their voices pitched low. "My grandson tasted one yesterday. He said it showed him nothing at all. Only darkness." "Darkness?" "Yes," he cried afterward. He thought he had done something wrong. Another woman, overhearing, shook her head. "It is only a bad year. Do not frighten the boy." But their voices carried a tremor that belied reassurance. Later, Koharu passed by the carpenter's workshop. He stood in the doorway, wiping sawdust from his hands, while his wife pressed a spoiled peach into his palm. "Look at it," she urged. The carpenter frowned as though trying to measure something he could not see, then tossed the fruit aside. It landed with a dull thud, splitting open to reveal flesh already brown. The town was not yet in panic, but unease crept like mist through narrow streets. People avoided speaking too directly, as though naming the trouble might give it power. One afternoon, Koharu visited her childhood friend Naokatsu, whose family kept bees at the far edge of the valley. The hives stood in neat rows, their white boxes humming with activity. Naokatsu greeted her with a grin that seemed to belong more to the boy she once knew than the man he had become. His hair was sunlightened, his arms tanned from work, and his eyes crinkled with good humor. "I heard you've returned," he said, offering her a seat on the porch. His wife, Yuri, brought tea and set it down with a shy smile. Their infant daughter slept inside, a faint cry reaching them now and then. As they sipped the tea, Naokatsu gestured toward the orchard. "The bees are restless. They fly farther these days, not content with the blossoms here. I wonder if they sense something." Koharu hesitated. "Have you noticed the fruit?" He raised his brows. "Ah, so you've seen it too. What do you think it means?" Naokatsu leaned back, folding his arms. "Every cycle has its weakness. Perhaps the orchard is growing old." His words startled her. "Old? But it has always been here. Our grandparents, their grandparents. It has never failed." "Even mountains change," he said quietly. "Rivers shift course. Why should the orchard be different?" Yuri glanced between them, uneasy. "Don't speak so. The orchard is our life." Naokatsu offered her a gentle smile. "I mean no disrespect, but we cannot assume it will last forever." Koharu left soon after, her thoughts tangled. The orchard growing old? The idea unsettled her more deeply than the sight of rot. That night, she dreamed of her mother. They walked side by side through rows of trees heavy with fruit. The air shimmered and voices floated like threads of song. Her mother reached for an apple, but when she turned it in her hand, the skin blackened, collapsing inward. Koharu cried out, but her mother only looked at her calmly. "Not all memories are meant to stay," she said. Koharu woke with tears on her cheeks. The house was silent except for her father's steady breathing in the next room. She lay staring at the ceiling beams, her mother's words echoing like a bell fading into distance. The following morning, Koharu ventured deeper into the orchard than before. The mist hung thick, muffling sound. She found clusters of fruit shriveled on the branch, though others beside them gleamed healthy. She reached for one of the spoiled plums and held it carefully. Its skin sagged like old paper, and as she pressed lightly, it burst, staining her fingers with dark juice. The scent rose sharply, acrid and strange. She touched her stained fingers to her lips, an instinct, though she knew it might be unwise. At once, a memory rushed through her. but it was not whole. She saw fragments, a pair of hands weaving straw, a voice humming off-key, then an abrupt void, as though someone had torn the page from a book. Her chest tightened. She gasped, stumbling back, wiping her mouth against her sleeve. The orchard was giving broken memories. She stood still, breath shallow, staring at the rose stretching away into mist. For the first time since her return, fear pressed against her ribs. By evening, the town square filled with hushed discussion. The headman, an elderly man named Ganosuke, called a gathering beneath the eaves of the shrine. Villagers clustered in groups, their faces pale in the lantern light. Ganosuke spoke slowly, his voice steady. The orchard has carried us through generations. It has given us more than sustenance. It has given us remembrance. We must not let a few spoiled fruits shake our faith. The harvest is near. We will continue as we always have. Murmurs rose, some agreeing, others doubtful. Koharu stood at the edge, listening. She felt eyes turn toward her, some hopeful, some suspicious. After all, she was Takeaki's daughter, heir to the orchard's care. One man muttered, "Perhaps she brought this with her, returning after so long." Another hissed, "Nonsense. The orchard chooses its own course." Koharu lowered her gaze, heart pounding. She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but her father stood silent beside her, his expression unreadable. When the gathering ended, lanterns bobbed away into the night, leaving the shrine steps empty. Koharu lingered, staring at the offering of fruit placed before the altar. Apples polished bright, plums arranged in a neat pyramid. She wondered if even those were beginning to sour inside. The night air carried a faint smell, not of incense but of rot. She shivered. Later, as she prepared to sleep, her father entered her room. He stood at the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. "You mustn't speak of what you saw," he said quietly. Koharu stared at him. "But father, the orchard is sick. People need to know." He shook his head. "To name it is to hasten it. Let us wait. Perhaps it will pass." "Pass?" Her voice cracked. "It's already begun." His gaze softened, though sorrow weighed in his eyes. "Trust the orchard, Koharu. It has endured more than we know." Then he slid the door closed, leaving her alone with the darkness. She lay awake long after, listening to the orchard's silence pressing close against the house. It was not the comforting hush she remembered from childhood. It was heavier, as though the trees themselves held their breath, waiting. And for the first time, Koharu wondered if the orchard was not only failing, but trying to speak. Chapter 3. Panic in the Harvest. The rains broke late that year. For days, the clouds hung low over the valley, their bellies swollen and dark. Then one night, the storm came. Wind rattling shutters, water slamming against the roof tiles, the orchard bending in a chorus of creaks and groans. Koharu woke to the sound of branches snapping somewhere beyond the garden wall. She rose and stood at the window, heart racing as the lightning flared across the ridges. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the valley washed clean and strangely hushed. Mist drifted low, curling among the trees. Koharu stepped outside with her father, both carrying baskets. They walked into the orchard to assess the damage. It was worse than she had feared. Dozens of fruits had fallen, bruised and split upon the ground. Many had darkened overnight, their flesh leaking juice that stained the earth. A heavy, cloying smell rose around them. Sweetness curdled into decay. Her father crouched, lifting a pear. He turned it in his hands, his expression carefully blank. "The storm was harsh," he said. But Koharu knew it was not only the storm. The rot had already begun before the rains came. Now it spread quickly, racing ahead of them. She picked up an apple, its skin marred with black veins. When she pressed lightly with her thumb, the fruit yielded too easily, collapsing inward. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to fling it away. "Father," she whispered, "the orchard is breaking." Takaki did not reply. He set the pear gently back on the ground as though it were a child he could not wake, then straightened and walked on. The town learned quickly. By midday, villagers streamed into the orchard, drawn by rumors. They moved through the rows in uneasy clusters, pointing to spoiled fruit, whispering with voices pitched low but carrying far. Koharu saw Shigenobu the blacksmith lift a basket of apples, only to drop it in dismay as several burst open in his hands. A group of children who had followed him cried out, the youngest clinging to his mother's sleeve. An elderly woman named Sayo clutched a plum, her fingers trembling. "This was to be for my granddaughter's wedding," she murmured, tears brimming. "What shall we give her now? What memories will she carry into her new life?" Others gathered near, their own concerns tumbling forth. Funerals approaching, festivals planned, births to be honored. The orchard's fruit was more than food. It was tradition, continuity, the fabric that held the valley's people together. Without it, their ceremonies were hollow. The square that evening buzzed with anxious voices. Genosuke, the headman, tried again to calm them, insisting patience, but unease had deepened into anger. "Patience?" Shigenobu barked. "Half my harvest is gone already." "My father is dying," another man cried. "He deserves to leave his memories behind, not rot in silence." Koharu stood at the edge, heart pounding. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Then, across the crowd, she saw Naokatsu. He met her gaze briefly, his expression grave, before turning back to murmur something to Yuri, who held their child close. The murmur of the crowd rose like a tide. For the first time in her life, Koharu felt the orchard no longer united the town, but divided it. The next morning, Koharu wandered alone among the trees. The smell of rot clung heavily. She knelt and gathered a cluster of pears, most already softened. Yet one, strangely, seemed firm despite its mottled skin. She held it in both hands, focusing without knowing why. A warmth spread from her palms into the fruit. She felt a faint tremor as though the pear itself sighed. When she turned it over again, the blemishes had faded slightly, the skin smoothing. Her breath caught. Carefully, she raised it to her lips and bit. The taste flooded her mouth, sweet, vibrant. And with it came a memory, whole and luminous. A young girl running through the orchard decades ago, her hair tied with a red ribbon, laughter spilling behind her. The vision was fleeting, but it was complete, unspoiled. Koharu lowered the fruit slowly, staring at it in disbelief. She had saved it. She tested the strange ability again and again in the following days. Not all fruits responded, but some did. Plums that brightened under her touch, apples that seemed to heal as though breathing anew. Each time she felt drained afterward, as if the orchard borrowed a piece of her. Sometimes her own thoughts blurred, fragments of memory slipping like water through her fingers. She would forget where she had placed her sandals or the exact face of her teacher from childhood. The losses were small, but they frightened her. Still, she continued, she could not stop, not while the town faltered. One afternoon, Sayo the widow approached her as she walked back with a basket. "Koharu," the old woman whispered, glancing about to be sure no one else heard. "I heard. You can save them." Koharu froze. "Who told you that?" "A child said he saw you. Please, I beg you, this plum—" Sayo held out a shriveled fruit, her hand shaking. "It was meant for my granddaughter's wedding. Can you help?" Koharu hesitated, then took it gently. She closed her eyes, focusing. Warmth stirred in her palms. The fruit trembled, brightened. When she returned it, whole and sweet, Sayo wept openly, clutching it to her chest. "You're blessed," the widow whispered, "blessed by the orchard itself." Word spread faster than fire. Within days, villagers came to her door in steady streams, some pleading, some demanding. They brought baskets of spoiled fruit, thrust them into her hands. Some pressed coins or gifts upon her. Others grew angry when she shook her head, too weary to attempt more. Koharu tried, but she could not keep pace. For every fruit she saved, dozens rotted beyond hope. And each success left her weaker, her thoughts muddled, her body heavy as though she carried not only her own memories, but fragments of everyone else's. One evening, after she had collapsed onto the porch, Naokatsu arrived. He crouched beside her, his expression troubled. "You must stop this," he said softly. "I can't," she whispered. "They need me." They need the orchard, he corrected. Not you. If you give yourself away piece by piece, what will be left of Koharu? She turned her face toward the dark rows of trees, their branches swaying faintly in the night air. If I don't help, the town will break. Now Katsu sighed, rubbing his hand through his hair. Perhaps the town needs to learn to live without the orchard's gift. She looked at him sharply. How can you say that? Because, he said quietly, I fear the orchard is asking us to. But the town did not want to hear of letting go. The following week, tensions boiled over. Two families quarreled in the marketplace, shouting over whose fruit deserved saving more. The argument turned to shoving, then blows, until others dragged them apart. Children watched wide-eyed as baskets spilled, apples rolling across the dirt. Koharu stood at the edge, trembling. She felt the eyes of both families turn to her, filled with desperation and accusation alike. You could end this, one man shouted. She plays favorites, another cried. Her father stepped forward then, placing himself between Koharu and the crowd. His voice was stern, carrying over the din. Enough, this is not her burden alone. But the murmurs continued, bitter and sharp. Koharu felt herself shrinking under their weight. That night, as she lay awake, she heard the orchard creak and sigh outside. She thought of the fruit in her basket, glowing faintly as though lit from within. She thought of the faces of those she had helped and those she had refused. And she realized the panic was no longer about the fruit itself. It was about memory, about the terror of losing what had once seemed eternal. The orchard had always been the valley's heart. Now, as it faltered, the people clutched at Koharu instead, as if she might serve in its place. But she knew deep down that she was no orchard. Chapter 4. The Burden of Knowing. Koharu had not expected the town to notice her efforts so quickly. At first, she thought the few fruits she had nursed back to life, coaxed into holding their radiance a little longer, might pass quietly among family and close neighbors. But in a town where little went unnoticed, where even a small change in the orchard's light seemed to ripple through every kitchen and hearth, word spread faster than she could have prepared for. It began with old Mrs. Natsue, who came hobbling down the narrow road one afternoon with her cane tapping out a rhythm against the stones. She leaned heavily on it, her back bent as though weighed down by the years themselves. Koharu had given her a single plum the week before, one she had managed to save in her late mother's wooden bowl. The old woman had eaten it silently at her kitchen table, tears rolling down her lined cheeks as memories of her long-departed sister returned in vivid color. Now, Mrs. Natsue clutched Koharu's hands with surprising strength. They say you can do it, she whispered hoarsely. They say you can keep them alive. The others are spoiling faster than I can reach for them, but you've found a way. Koharu tried to brush it aside. It's nothing, really. A trick of timing. Perhaps the weather favored me. But Mrs. Natsue shook her head, her cloudy eyes sharp. Don't play at humility. We've all seen the rot. Yet your fruit shines. By evening, 3 more visitors had come. Men she barely knew. Children tugging at their mother's sleeves, all carrying baskets or jars, hopeful expressions shadowed by desperation. They asked, some gently, some urgently, if she might look at their harvest. And though she told them again and again that it was no certainty, that she had no secret method, she found herself surrounded by faces that could not let hope go unanswered. The days that followed unfolded in a blur of pressure. Koharu rose before dawn, walked the misted rows of her family's orchard with baskets clutched in her arms, and listened. She didn't know what she was listening for. Perhaps the faint hum of the trees, perhaps the orchard's weary breathing. But something in her told her that presence mattered. That if she stayed near, if she handled each fruit as though it were the most fragile vessel, then rot would hesitate. She discovered it wasn't only the touch of her hands, but her attention itself, as if the orchard responded to being seen and tended with undivided care. When her mind drifted, the fruit seemed to dim. When she lingered, whispering half-formed words from old lullabies her mother once sang, the fruit brightened as though recalling a melody of its own. But the work drained her. By the second week, she fell into bed each night with her arms aching, her thoughts scattered, her memories slippery around the edges. Sometimes she awoke unsure whether she had dreamt of conversations with her parents or actually remembered them. Once, she reached for her mother's shawl and for a terrible instant could not recall its color. And yet, each morning, the baskets outside her door multiplied. The townsfolk's gratitude came in waves, but so did their demands. Some came humbly, bringing offerings of bread, smoked fish, or hand-sewn cloth. Others grew insistent, pushing her door open without knocking, leaving their fruit with stern instructions as though she were a hired worker. Koharu tried to keep pace, tried to remind herself these were her neighbors, people she had grown up among, yet something in their eyes unsettled her. They looked at her not as Koharu, the quiet girl who once sat under the ginkgo trees reading borrowed books, but as a vessel, a tool, perhaps even a savior. One evening, after tending to more fruit than she could count, she found her childhood friend, Takeyoshi, waiting outside. He had left town years ago, apprenticed to a carpenter in the valley, and had only recently returned when his father's health failed. His face, sun-browned and tired, held a softness that most others lacked. "You look half gone," he said quietly, taking in her pallor. Koharu tried to smile. "I'm only tired. It will pass." "Don't lie to me. I can see it's taking something from you." She looked away, unwilling to confess aloud what she feared, that every fruit she saved seemed to cost her some small sliver of herself. That night, alone in her kitchen, Koharu sat with one of the saved plums cupped in her hands. Its skin gleamed faintly even in the dim lamplight, the way memory fruit always did when it was ready. Something about it tugged at her, insistent. She hesitated, then bit into it. A rush of sensation overwhelmed her. The scent of wood smoke, the sound of laughter, her father's voice calling across the rows of trees. She staggered, gripping the edge of the table. This memory was not hers alone. It was her father's, captured on some long-ago autumn day. He was younger, his hair darker, his hands strong and sure as he lifted her mother into a wagon filled with harvest baskets. And then, almost abruptly, the memory twisted. Her father was speaking in hushed tones to another man, words strained, urgent. She couldn't catch them all, but she heard enough. "Can't let them know. Orchard won't last forever." The memory dissolved, leaving Koharu gasping, tears on her cheeks. The revelation sat heavy in her chest. She had grown up believing the orchard was eternal, a gift woven into the mountain's soil and the town's spirit. To hear her father, practical and steady, confess otherwise, it shook something fundamental. And worse, she now knew that her family had carried secrets about the orchard's limits, secrets never shared with her. By morning, she resolved to keep this knowledge quiet. The town already pressed on her with unbearable weight. If they knew she had glimpsed a warning from the past, panic would sweep through them like wildfire. But silence was its own burden. Every knock at her door, every pleading voice, deepened the knot in her chest. She could not save them all, and now she knew she was preserving more than memories. She was preserving a fragile lie. And so, as the chapter of her life in the orchard deepened, Koharu found herself trapped between the gifts she had never asked for and the truth she could scarcely bear. The town saw her as hope incarnate, but within her, she felt only the slow erosion of self, a hollowing that grew each time she reached to rescue another piece of the past. The orchard, too, seemed to sense her struggle. When she walked its rows, she thought she heard it sighing, not in gratitude but in exhaustion, as though it wished she would stop. For the first time in her life, Koharu began to wonder if the orchard remembered too much. Chapter 5. Memory Wars. The quarrel began, as so many things did in the town, over something small enough to seem trivial at first glance. Two families, both of them long established in the valley, both known for speaking their minds too freely, met at the southern rows of the orchard at dawn, each certain they had the better claim to a half-filled basket of pears. The pears in question were peculiar. Green-skinned with faint golden specks, unusually unblemished given how much fruit had spoiled that season. Whoever had picked them left the basket unattended for less than an hour. When they returned, it was gone. The next morning, the same pairs appeared outside another home, set neatly on the stoop, as though they belonged there all along. At first, the argument was only words, raised voices carrying across the trees, children peeking from behind low stone walls to watch their elders bicker. But by the time Koharu arrived, drawn by the noise while on her way to the spring, the dispute had swollen into something harsher. Men clutched at each other's sleeves, women shouted accusations, and someone had taken a cane to the earth with such force that it left gouges in the soil. "Koharu will know," a woman cried the moment she appeared at the edge of the orchard. "She'll see which pears were blessed by her touch." A dozen eyes turned toward her, hungry and sharp. Koharu froze. "I don't mark the fruit," she said carefully. "If they shine a little brighter, that's only chance, not my doing." But no one listened. The families glared at one another as though the orchard itself depended on their claim. Koharu, in desperation, stepped forward and lifted one of the pears. She turned it in her hand, watching the way the light caught against its skin. There was a faint glow, yes. But then, she thought, all memory fruit glowed in certain moments. "This pear," she said at last, "remembers something important. But it isn't mine to decide who receives it." And with that, she set the pear back in the basket and walked away. Her refusal did not end the quarrel. That evening, Takayoshi came to her home, weary-eyed, and told her the families had nearly come to blows after she left. In the end, they split the pears in half, though both sides insisted the other had taken the sweeter portion. "It won't stop there," he warned. "They'll drag you into every quarrel from now on." The warning proved true. Within days, people arrived not only to plead for her help in preserving fruit, but to ask her judgment on who deserved what remained. A young couple, childless after years of trying, came begging for a fruit said to carry memories of laughter and the cries of newborns. An elder, shaking with the frailty of his final months, demanded the same fruit so he might taste one last reminder of his youth. Koharu stood in her kitchen as both parties stared at her, eyes shining with desperation. She wanted to vanish into the earth. "You don't understand," she said at last. "The orchard was never meant for choosing, it gave freely. I don't have the right to decide who deserves more." But they would not leave without an answer. That night, she lay awake long after the lamp had gone dark, staring at the ceiling beams her father once repaired with his own hands. She thought of how the orchard's gift, meant to be shared like sunlight and rain, had become a commodity, something measured and hoarded and fought over. And she thought, too, of the memory she had glimpsed of her father, the urgent voice, the warning whispered to another man. The orchard won't last forever. By midsummer, the tension in town was unmistakable. Baskets were hidden behind locked doors. Neighbors eyed one another's harvests with suspicion. Market days grew thinner as families hoarded fruit for themselves rather than trading it openly. Even the children were not spared. Koharu overheard them bickering in the lanes, boasting of which memories their families had kept and mocking those who had none. She felt something twist painfully inside her. Once, children had gathered under the orchard trees at dusk, passing fruits between them and marveling at fragments of lives they could barely imagine. First kisses, fishing trips, lullabies sung to infants long grown. Now they fought like their parents, clinging to scraps of sweetness while the rest spoiled on the ground. The orchard itself seemed restless. When Koharu walked its rows, she felt the air shift around her, heavy with a silence that was not quite silence. The leaves rustled though there was no wind. The soil, damp from summer rains, seemed to pulse faintly beneath her shoes. More than once she paused, certain she had heard her name whispered among the branches. One evening, she brought Takayoshi with her. "Do you hear it?" she asked quietly as they stood between two rows of cherry trees, their blossoms long gone, their branches heavy with darkening fruit. He listened. After a long moment, he shook his head. Only the crickets. Koharu bit her lip. She wanted to tell him that she felt the orchard was speaking, not in words, but in something deeper, a murmur beneath her ribs. But she could not bring herself to say it aloud. Already the town saw her as something strange, half believed and half feared. If she confessed this, even Takayoshi might step back from her. One night, unable to sleep, she walked to the orchard alone. The moon was high, silvering the rows in pale light. She crouched beside a tree whose roots twisted like old hands and pressed her palm to the soil. "Tell me what you want," she whispered. For a long time there was nothing. Only the night air, the rustle of leaves. But then, whether imagined or true, she felt a warmth rise from the ground into her hand. Images flickered in her mind. Fallen fruit returning to the earth, seeds carried by wind, new shoots rising where the old had died. A cycle, endless, necessary. She jerked her hand back, gasping. The orchard was not only failing, it was changing. And perhaps it wanted to change. When she returned home that night, her door was barred with a wooden plank. Someone had scrawled a mark across it in charcoal, a circle with a line through it, the old sign for withheld blessings. Her chest tightened. This was not the work of children. It was a message. By morning, neighbors avoided her gaze. Some still came with baskets, but more than a few turned their backs when she passed. Whispers followed her steps through the market lanes. Takayoshi was furious when he saw the mark. "This is cowardice," he muttered. "They depend on you, then curse you in the same breath. I'll find who did this." But Koharu stopped him. "No, leave it. If they fear me, then so be it." For though the mark stung, it also brought clarity. She could no longer pretend she was simply helping. The town had begun to see her as something more and less than human. And in the orchard, she had begun to sense truths she did not yet understand. Chapter 6. The Price of Preservation. Koharu first noticed it on a morning that should have been ordinary. She had risen before dawn, as she always did now, and gone to the orchard with her basket. The air was still cool, threaded with the faint sweetness of overripe fruit, and she meant only to collect what could be saved before the sun rose too high. But when she reached the third row of plums, she stopped, blinking at the ground. The basket was already half full. She stared at it, trying to remember which trees she had harvested. Her hands knew the weight of the fruit. Her arms knew the ache of carrying them, but her mind was empty. No memory of plucking the plums, of brushing the leaves aside, of lifting each fruit gently to check for rot. It was as though an hour had been stolen from her life, replaced with nothing. She stood frozen in the stillness of the orchard, the dawn light washing her face pale. It might have been fatigue, she told herself. Too many long days, too little sleep. She tried to shake the unease from her shoulders and bent to gather more. But later that morning, when she returned home, she found herself searching her cupboards for her mother's shawl. It had been a gift, woven in warm ochre wool, always draped over the same chair by the fire. She remembered it clearly. Only, when she opened the cupboard, the shawl was not there. And when she tried to picture it, the color wavered in her mind, slipping between ochre and gray, between wool and cotton. She pressed her palms to her eyes, willing the memory to settle. It did not. As the days passed, more fragments slipped. Small things at first. The shape of the old mill's roof, the name of a neighbor's youngest child, the tune of a lullaby her mother used to hum. She would reach for them and find only blankness, as though moths had chewed holes through the fabric of her past. She began to suspect the truth. Each fruit she saved demanded something of her in return. It was not simply her strength or her hours that the orchard consumed. It was her memory, herself. The town, of course, noticed none of this. To them, Koharu seemed only more indispensable. The fruit she touched shone brighter, lasted longer, carried memories unbroken. Families whispered that perhaps she was blessed by the orchard itself, chosen to preserve what would otherwise be lost. Their visits grew more insistent. They came not only with baskets, but with stories, pleas for why their memories mattered more than others. One man spoke of his wife who had died in childbirth, how the fruit from their wedding day was all he had left of her laughter. Another begged for a single plum so his son might taste the voice of the grandfather he would never meet. Koharu listened, her chest tightening with each request. She wanted to help them all, but every fruit she rescued left her emptier, her own past eroding. She feared what would happen when there was nothing left of her to give. One evening, Takayoshi found her sitting on the steps outside her home, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes unfocused. You've gone pale again, he said, crouching beside her. You're overworking yourself. I don't know who I am anymore, she whispered. He frowned. What do you mean? She shook her head, unable to explain. How could she tell him that she no longer remembered which lullaby her mother sang? That she had begun to forget the exact sound of her father's voice? That saving the orchard's fruit was costing her the orchard of her own mind? Instead, she managed only, it feels like they're taking pieces of me, one by one. Takayoshi's hand tightened briefly on hers. Then stop. Let someone else bear it. But there was no one else. The breaking point came with a child. A girl no older than 10 knocked at Koharu's door one morning, clutching a small, shriveled peach. Her eyes were swollen from crying. This was my brother's, she said. He went away to the city last year. Mama says we can't afford for him to come home. But this peach, it was from the day he left. It remembers him. Can you fix it, please? The fruit was far gone, its skin wrinkled, its light dimmed to a faint glimmer. Koharu knew it would cost her dearly, yet she could not refuse. She cupped the peach in both hands, closing her eyes. She poured herself into it, the warmth of her palms, the scraps of her own memory, the very ache of her longing. Slowly, the peach brightened, its skin softening, its fragrance filling the room. The girl gasped. It's him. I can feel it. Koharu smiled faintly, but when the door closed and silence returned, she staggered to the table and gripped its edge, trembling. She tried to recall her own brother, long dead of fever when she was small. His name, his face. She reached for them desperately and found nothing. The orchard had taken him from her. The realization left her hollow. For nights afterward, she dreamed of walking through endless rows of trees, each one bearing fruit she had saved, glowing softly in the darkness. But when she reached for one, the fruit dissolved, and with it some piece of herself she had once held dear. She began to wonder if this was the orchard's bargain all along, that for every memory preserved, another must be surrendered, that perhaps this was why her father had whispered warnings in the past. Still, when the townsfolk came, she could not turn them away. Their grief pressed against her like waves against a crumbling shore. And so she continued, even as her own shoreline eroded, piece by piece. Takayoshi confronted her again one evening, his voice low but edged with anger. You're vanishing, Koharu. Don't think I don't see it. You forget things you once knew as well as your own name. Yesterday you didn't recognize Mrs. Natsue's son, and you played together as children. What will be left of you if you keep on? Koharu's throat tightened. If I stop, what will be left of them? They'll endure. People always have. But you? His words faltered. You can't sacrifice yourself for everyone else. She wanted to believe him, but when she looked at the townsfolk, their faces lined with fear and yearning, she could not imagine stepping aside. What frightened her most was not the thought of forgetting. It was the thought of remembering too well what it felt like to let them down. And so the weeks bled together. Koharu continued her quiet labor, her hands steady, her gaze weary, her past dissolving in fragments. She no longer sang as she worked. The songs had slipped from her entirely. She no longer lingered by the ginkgo trees, unsure if she had ever truly read there as a child, or if that too was a memory borrowed from another's fruit. The orchard pulsed around her, its silence heavy with unspoken truths. Sometimes, when she pressed her palm to the bark, she felt it breathing with her, as though absorbing not only her memories, but her very essence. The town praised her, the town resented her, and Koharu, caught between savior and scapegoat, could no longer tell which fragments of her life belonged to her, and which were slipping into the orchard's soil. Chapter 7. Threads Between Us. The mountain air that summer carried a heaviness none of them could ignore. It was not simply the weight of heat or the pressure of storms threading across the ridges, but something more insidious, an unease that had begun to settle inside the townsfolk, a creeping suspicion that even their memories, the very gift that had steadied them for generations, might not endure. Koharu had begun to notice the orchard's paths filling with footprints, not just of families out for harvest, but of neighbors stopping by at unusual hours, seeking reassurance, or perhaps proof. They wandered through the rows in silence, waiting to see whether any fruit might glow with that faint, living sheen, which marked a memory preserved. More often than not, they found only withering husks, skins puckered before their time, the promise inside shriveled. The silence that followed such discoveries lingered in the air long after the people had returned home. Her days had become crowded with small urgencies. Masato, his brows drawn close together, had begun to keep ledgers of every tree that still bore healthy fruit, recording them as though they were accounts that might one day require proof before an unseen tribunal. Aya, wearied but steady, walked the rows each morning, her shawl drawn tight though the air was warm, speaking soft words as if the trees might hear her encouragement. Children followed her sometimes, clutching their little baskets, hoping to glimpse one of the miraculous survivors Koharu had learned to coax back from rot. Yet the orchard could not be persuaded to bend fully to their will. Even Koharu's interventions felt tenuous. There were mornings she rose with certainty that she might save a dozen fruits, perhaps more, only to find her hands faltering, the glow failing at the last instant, the memory inside slipping away. Those she managed to preserve were passed with ceremony to their families, but each act of saving only emphasized how many could not be salvaged. It was in these strange weeks that whispers began to thread themselves through the town, suspicions about who was hoarding fruit, who was choosing which memories to rescue and which to let slip away. No one voiced their accusations outright. Not at first, but glances lingered longer than before. Invitations to supper faltered. The old camaraderie, once effortless, was thinning, and Koharu felt it most acutely in the way neighbors now paused before speaking to her, as though weighing whether she might be keeping some secret of her own. She understood their unease. The work she did with the fruit was not easily explained, even to herself. When her hands cupped a piece on the brink of ruin, there came a moment, delicate, suspended, when she could feel its pulse, faint as a bird's heartbeat. If she breathed with it, steady and unhurried, the rot seemed to retreat, the skin smoothing, color returning. But it was not consistent, and she could not summon it on command. Some days the orchard answered her as though they were kin. Others, it turned silent and unyielding. Masato had watched her once, notebook pressed against his chest, and afterwards he spoke quietly. If only we could teach others. Spread what you do so the burden isn't only yours. Koharu had shaken her head. It isn't teaching. It's listening, and sometimes they don't speak. By midsummer, the council called for gatherings in the town square, benches dragged from homes so all could sit beneath the wide canopy of linden trees. They came with worry stamped plain on their faces, the elders in their neat jackets, younger families clutching infants or baskets filled with fruit already fading. Aya sat among them, her hands folded in her lap, gaze steady on the men and women who rose to speak. One by one, voices carried across the crowd. Proposals tumbled forth. To ration harvests more strictly, to forbid visits to the orchard except by family groups, to establish a committee that might choose which memories deserved saving. Each suggestion was met with nods from some, murmurs from others. The idea of a committee in particular stirred unease, though few said so directly. For who among them could claim the right to decide which grandmother's song, which child's first laughter, which father's advice was worthy of preserving above another? It was Aya who rose last, her movements slow but deliberate. The square fell quiet as she spoke. We have lived with this gift for longer than our stories can tell. It has not been ours to command, but ours to receive. If it falters now, we must tend it as we would tend each other, with patience, with care, with humility. No council, no committee will mend what pride may unravel. Let us not turn against one another while the orchard suffers. Her words held them for a time, and though unease did not vanish, a measure of calm returned. Yet Koharu could see in their eyes the hunger for certainty remained unfulfilled. The orchard, once a place of abundance, had become an uncertain ledger of what might be lost next. One evening, as cicadas droned and the horizon burned with the last of the day's heat, Koharu lingered in the rows longer than usual. Her basket lay nearly empty, save for 2 small plums whose skins glimmered faintly. She thought of her mother then, how she had carried baskets far heavier, and with laughter that carried through the orchard. That laughter was still caught somewhere in the fruit, passed among them, though Koharu had not tasted it in years. She wondered suddenly whether it, too, might fade if the harvests failed entirely. A voice startled her from her reverie. "You walk as though the trees might answer you," said Renji, the carpenter's son, who had drifted near with his quiet gait. He was not much older than Koharu, but bore the calm of someone used to working with wood, his hands accustomed to patience. Koharu offered a faint smile. "Perhaps they do. Or perhaps I've grown too used to listening for what isn't there." Renji studied her a moment. "My father says the orchard's memory is no different from the grain of wood. It carries its life inside, every ring a story of rain and drought. But if rot sets in, you cannot chase it away. You can only cut carefully, salvage what is sound, and let go of what is not." The simplicity of the thought lingered with her. She wondered if her own attempts were merely that, cuts against rot, delicate as carving wood. But where Renji's work produced beams and planks, hers was measured in voices and laughter, in faces carried forward. The stakes felt unbearably heavier. As summer leaned toward its height, another change arose. Subtle but unmistakable. Some families began to report that even fruit which appeared sound yielded only fragments when eaten. A laugh without its context, a half-remembered song fading before the second verse. It was as though the memories themselves were thinning, unraveling at their edges. This discovery deepened the town's unease. For if the orchard not only failed to ripen but also offered broken threads of memory, what did that mean for their past? Could a life be remembered in fragments, scattered beyond recognition? The elders spoke of dreams haunted by voices they could not place, as though memories that had once been safely stored were now seeping away, returning without anchor. Koharu felt it too. There were mornings she awoke with a song in her ears she knew must have belonged to her mother, yet the words slipped through her grasp like water. She would rise, heart pounding, and search the orchard for a fruit that might hold the missing phrase, but found none. The loss was sharp, a grief unlike any other, for it was not the absence of a person, but the absence of their presence. One night, unable to sleep, Koharu stepped outside and found Aya seated on the porch, lantern lit beside her. The older woman's expression was not one of fear, but of deep weariness, lines carved deeper by worry. "The town is fraying," Aya murmured as Koharu settled beside her. "Not only in fruit, but in trust. Do you feel it?" Koharu nodded. "They're afraid of choosing wrong, afraid of losing what matters most." "And you, child, what are you afraid of?" Koharu hesitated. The lantern's glow caught her face, making honesty unavoidable. "That I'm not enough. That whatever gift I have won't save us. Not truly. That I'll be asked to do what can't be done." Aya reached for her hand, her grip soft but steady. "Then remember this. No one has ever saved an orchard alone. We have endured because we have endured together. If you listen long enough, you'll hear not only the trees, but the people who surround them." The words settled in Koharu like roots pressing deeper into soil. She thought of Renji's quiet wisdom, of Masato's careful records, of neighbors who still came despite their fear. Perhaps endurance was not a single act of preservation, but the slow weaving of many threads, fragile on their own, stronger when bound together. By late August, storms rolled more frequently through the mountains, clouds dragging long shadows across the slopes. Rain fell in sudden bursts, leaving the air damp and heavy. The orchard, beneath its dripping leaves, seemed to hold its breath. One afternoon, after a downpour, Koharu walked the rows and found something she had not expected. A cluster of pears, their skins gleaming gold, each one vibrant, alive with memory. She touched them lightly and felt a warmth pulse beneath her palm. They were unspoiled, full, and when she carried them to Aya, the older woman's eyes shone with both relief and sorrow. "See here," Aya said, stroking the fruit as though it were a child. "Not all is lost. The orchard still remembers." The discovery spread quickly through the town, hearts lifting for the first time in months. Families came with renewed hope, searching for their own small miracles. And though most found little, the sight of Koharu's pears, whole, radiant, reminded them that the orchard was not yet finished. But Koharu, even in her joy, felt the weight of a question pressing deeper. If the orchard could still remember, then what was it asking of them? What had changed in their lives, in their hearts, that it faltered now? And what threads, still hidden, might they need to weave back into place before it was too late? Chapter 8. The Orchard's Silence. The orchard had always been a place of voices. Not voices one could hear in the ordinary sense, but presences carried in the rustle of leaves, in the cool hush between rows where memories waited inside fruit, humming faintly. Koharu had grown up with that constant undercurrent. She could walk blindfolded along the paths and still sense the orchard's life as surely as the mountain air filled her lungs. But now, more often than not, there was a stillness she could not explain. She would step among the rows at dawn, dew glistening like beads of glass on leaves, and feel only emptiness, as though the trees themselves had drawn inward, listening to some sorrow she could not yet name. The pears she had found, whole and vibrant after the storm, had offered brief reprieve. Yet since then, the orchard seemed to hold itself apart, retreating into silence. Koharu told no one of this feeling at first. The town clung to the hope of those golden pears, carrying the story like a charm against despair. She could not bear to diminish that fragile hope by confessing that the orchard now seemed mute, its fruit still failing, its presence slipping. Masato, however, began to notice. He joined her one morning, ledger tucked beneath his arm, and watched as she moved from tree to tree with deliberate patience. "You stop more often now," he remarked, keeping his voice low. "But your hands don't linger." Koharu forced a smile. "Perhaps I'm simply tired." Masato studied her a long moment, then jotted something into his notebook. "Or perhaps the orchard is." The town's unease deepened. Families who had stored memories for decades began to discover that jars once brimming with preserved fruits now spoiled more quickly than before. Whole baskets, carefully dried and sealed, crumbled to dust when touched. It was as though the orchard's failing stretched backward, undoing what had once seemed secure. One evening, Renji came to the house, his hands stained with resin, the smell of sawdust clinging to him. He carried a small box he had carved, simple in shape but lined with cedar. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay 3 fruits Koharu had saved for his family. "They've begun to fade," he said, setting the box carefully on the table. "I thought the cedar might protect them, keep them longer, but it hasn't." Koharu unwrapped the cloth. The fruits were softening already, skins bruised where memory should have gleamed. She pressed her thumb lightly against one, willing it to brighten, but nothing stirred. She looked up to find Renji's gaze steady, not accusing, but searching. "Then we must ask why," he said quietly. "What is it the orchard is asking of us?" The question lodged itself in Koharu's mind. She began to spend hours not in saving fruit, but in listening, sitting cross-legged beneath the largest tree at the orchard's heart. The wind shifted through the branches, carrying scents of earth and moss, but no voice came. She pressed her palm to the trunk, felt the roughness of bark, but there was only silence. One dusk, Aya joined her, settling beside her with the ease of someone who had walked the rows since childhood. They sat together until the sky dimmed into violet. Finally, Aya spoke. "When your mother was your age, she used to tell me she could hear songs in the orchard. Not words, not melodies we could hum, but a cadence, like water beneath stone. Perhaps what you call silence is only a song you do not yet know how to hear." Koharu turned the thought over. If the orchard was not silent but speaking in a tongue she could not yet grasp, then what was she missing? The council gathered again, voices sharper than before. Proposals returned, but this time tinged with urgency. Restrict all fruit to elders, for their memories were most valuable. Ration not only harvest but access, with guards to prevent theft. Send word down the mountain to outsiders who might offer remedies, though many feared strangers would never understand the orchard's gift. Koharu stood at the edge of the square, watching as neighbors argued, their hands slicing the air, their eyes flashing with desperation. The orchard had always bound them together. Now it was tearing seams open. She remembered Aya's words. No one saves an orchard alone. But here they seemed bent on isolating themselves further. When Masato rose to speak, his voice shook. I have records of which trees still bear fruit and who has taken what. But this keeping of accounts, it feels wrong. We are not merchants tallying debts. We are families. If we reduce the orchard to numbers, will we not lose more than fruit? His words quieted the square, but unease lingered. The townsfolk dispersed with nothing resolved, each carrying their fear home. Koharu's own fear reached her in dreams. She dreamt of walking the orchard only to find the trees bare, branches skeletal against a pale sky. She dreamt of lifting fruit to her lips only for it to crumble into ash, memories scattering like smoke. She awoke with her heart pounding, the taste of loss bitter in her mouth. One morning after such a dream, she wandered further than usual, past the familiar rows into a corner rarely visited, where brambles tangled and paths thinned. There, she found a tree older than any she had known, its trunk gnarled, branches heavy with leaves but bearing no fruit at all. She stood before it, breath caught. The silence here was different. Not empty, but dense, as though the tree held its voice deep within, too vast to release. She pressed her palm to its bark and felt something stir. Not a memory, not a pulse, but a weight, like the hush of countless years compressed into a single moment. She drew back, shaken. When she told Aya later, the older woman nodded. That tree has stood since before my grandmother's time. We do not harvest from it. Some say it remembers more than any of us could bear. Koharu wondered then if the orchard's silence was not absence but fullness. Memories too heavy to be carried, too vast to be shared. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of small salvations and larger losses. Koharu still managed to rescue a few fruits each week, though never enough to ease the town's hunger. Renji continued to bring her cedar boxes, quietly determined to offer some protection. Masato filled pages with notes, though his eyes grew shadowed. Aya, steady as ever, walked the rows and reminded them that despair was a choice they must not make. Yet beneath all their efforts, the orchard's silence thickened. Even the children, once prone to laughter as they ran between rows, now played quietly, as though afraid to disturb something fragile. The fruit that survived carried memories, yes, but their glow was dimmer, as though the orchard itself were growing weary. Koharu began to wonder if memory, too, could die. Not in the forgetting of people, but in the exhaustion of the land that held them. And if so, what then would they become? A town with no orchard, no tether to their past. One evening, as the first hints of autumn touched the air, Renji found her beneath the ancient tree once more. He did not speak at first, only stood beside her, hands resting against the rough bark. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were steady. If the orchard is silent, then perhaps it is asking us to speak, not to listen for what it gives, but to give back what we have carried. The thought struck her with force. She remembered the way Aya had spoken in the square, the way Masato kept his careful ledgers, the way children clutched baskets filled with hope. Perhaps the orchard's silence was not abandonment, but invitation. Perhaps it waited for them to return what had always been theirs, to offer not only their hunger for memory, but their voices, their lives, their stories in the present. As she stood there in the dimming light, Koharu felt something stir in her chest. Not certainty, not solution, but a thread of possibility, delicate and strong. Chapter 9. The Stories We Return. The first signs of autumn settled quietly upon the mountains. Mornings arrived cooler, with mist coiling low across the fields before burning away in sunlight. The orchard's leaves, once lush and deep green, began to tip toward gold, then copper. The fruit that remained clung stubbornly to branches, fewer than anyone could remember, their skins still prone to bruising long before they ripened. Yet amid this dwindling abundance, Koharu carried in her heart a new thought, Renji's words about giving back. She did not know precisely what he meant. Still, she began to notice the small ways people already gave to the orchard without realizing. Aya, speaking softly to the trees, Masato recording each detail as though memory itself might be preserved on the page, children weaving fallen leaves into garlands and hanging them on branches. These gestures were humble, unplanned, but each carried something of themselves. Koharu wondered, what if the orchard's silence was not a sign of its retreat, but a waiting pause, a call for them to return something, not in baskets or ledgers, but in stories, voices, presence? That thought took hold during the festival season. Every autumn, before the first frost, the town gathered in the square to mark the turning of the year, a tradition that long predated Koharu's memory. This year, the council had debated canceling, declaring that celebration would mock their troubles. Yet Aya argued firmly against it. If we do not gather, she said, then the orchard's silence will become our own. We must stand together, even in hunger. So the festival was held, though with fewer lanterns and less food. The square filled nonetheless, neighbors pulling on coats against the chill, children darting between benches. At the center, musicians tuned worn instruments, their notes tentative but warm. When the music began, Koharu noticed something striking. People sang more loudly than usual, their voices unpolished but full, rising into the night air. Perhaps it was defiance, perhaps longing, but the sound swelled until the square seemed to vibrate with it. Koharu closed her eyes and thought she felt the orchard beyond the square listening. Later that night, as lanterns guttered low, Renji came to her side. "Do you hear it?" he asked. Koharu nodded. "It's as if the whole town has been waiting to speak." Then perhaps this is what the orchard needs. Not only fruit carried away, but our voices carried back. The following day, Koharu asked Aya whether stories had ever been offered to the orchard, not merely received. Aya's brows lifted thoughtfully. "Long ago," she said, "families would gather at harvest's end and tell aloud what the fruit had given them that year. My grandmother said they did it to thank the orchard so the trees would know their gifts had not gone unnoticed. But the practice fell away, little by little, until we only listened, never spoke back." The answer struck Koharu like a bell rung clear. She remembered the old tree in the orchard's corner, heavy with silence. Perhaps it was not withholding, but waiting. Waiting for the people to return what they had hoarded too long. She began quietly. That evening, beneath the old tree, she told a memory aloud. The sound of her mother's laughter while plucking plums, the way her sleeves brushed her cheeks when she reached too high. Her voice faltered at first, unused to speaking so openly to the air. But as she continued, she felt the orchard shift around her. The faint stir of wind, the scent of earth rising sharper. It was not an answer, but it was presence. The next night, she brought Masato. At first, he looked uncertain, but then he opened his ledger and read from his notes. Not only numbers of trees and baskets, but small details he had scribbled in margins. How the light slanted through branches in July, how one child tripped and laughed while running. His voice, usually clipped, grew warmer as he read. Renji joined them, offering not words but the simple act of carving a small figure from a fallen branch and placing it at the tree's roots. Aya came too, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades, recounting the first song she had ever heard from her grandmother in the orchard. The silence that followed was different than before. Not empty, but full. Koharu thought of Aya's phrase, "a song you do not yet know how to hear." Perhaps this was it, woven not only from the orchard but from themselves. Word spread. Families, hesitant at first, began to gather in the rows at dusk, bringing baskets not to carry fruit but to sit upon. They spoke their stories aloud, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes halting, sometimes with tears. They recounted first steps, last farewells, quarrels, reconciliations. Children told their dreams, elders told their regrets. The orchard became a place of confession, of gratitude, of voices braided together. Something subtle shifted. Not all fruit revived, but a few began to glow more brightly, as if strengthened. The orchard's silence softened, filled with murmurs. People began to leave offerings, woven wreaths, carved figures, folded scraps of paper with words scrawled upon them, at the roots of trees. The orchard, once a place of extraction, was becoming a place of exchange. Yet not everyone welcomed this change. Some muttered that stories could not replace fruit, That time spent speaking aloud was time wasted when harvests were thin. A few families withdrew, guarding their remaining fruit jealously, refusing to join gatherings. The town was not healed. Not yet. One evening, as Koharu walked home, a woman approached her. Naoko, whose family had always been wary. Her eyes were sharp, her voice clipped. Do you think stories will feed us? Do you think they will preserve my father's wisdom when the fruit crumbles in our hands? Koharu hesitated. I don't know, but the orchard listens differently now. Isn't that worth trying? Naoko's gaze hardened. Or perhaps it listens only to you, and we are being led astray. She turned before Koharu could answer, leaving a sting in her words. That night, Koharu lay awake, doubts pricking her. Was she mistaking coincidence for miracle? Was the orchard's faint revival truly tied to their stories? Or was it merely chance? Yet, when dawn came, she returned to the old tree. She placed her hand on its bark and whispered her doubt aloud, not hiding it. If I am wrong, forgive me. If I am right, guide us. The air stirred, a single leaf drifting down to land in her palm. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the faint tremor of life. Not certainty, not proof, but enough. As autumn deepened, the town's evenings grew marked by voices rising in the orchard. It was not always harmonious. Stories clashed, tears mixed with laughter. But it was alive. The orchard's silence was no longer oppressive, but receptive, like soil loosening for seed. And for the first time in many months, Koharu began to believe that survival might not mean saving every fruit, but learning to weave what remained with what they gave back. A balance not of abundance, but of reciprocity. Chapter 10. The Bargain of Silence. The rain had not stopped for 4 days. It began with a fine drizzle, almost comforting, before deepening into a steady curtain that blurred the mountain paths and left the orchard soil heavy and bruised. Koharu watched the downpour from her grandmother's veranda, the mist folding in and out of the valley like a living breath. Normally, such rain would be a blessing for the trees, a deep drink before the heat of late summer. But now, with the rot spreading faster each week, every droplet carried a sense of dread, as if the orchard itself were being smothered. She pulled her shawl tighter and listened to the low voices inside. Her grandmother had gathered several elders from the town people whose families had tended the orchard as long as hers had. The walls between rooms were thin enough that Koharu could hear snatches of their conversation, hushed, urgent, and edged with resignation. Even the old trees nearest the river have blackened. A season lost is survivable, but if it continues into autumn, our children will forget. Our grandchildren will inherit nothing. Koharu pressed her palm against the wooden post beside her, steadying herself against the storm in the air and the storm in their words. The thought of an inheritance interrupted not of land or wealth, but of memory itself made her stomach knot. What good was a tradition if it was severed before its meaning could pass along? When she finally entered, the room fell quiet. The elders sat in a circle, their expressions weary, lit by the dim flicker of an oil lamp. Her grandmother, Fuyuko, gestured toward her with a mixture of pride and reluctance. Koharu has kept some of the fruit alive, she said. Not enough, but some. She may have inherited more of the orchard's bond than the rest of us. The elders turned their eyes on her, heavy and searching. One of them, a tall man with a narrow face, Saburo from the Northern Slope families, leaned forward. Child, he said, his voice cracked with age. Tell us plainly, how do you preserve what we cannot? Koharu swallowed. I don't know if I can explain. Listen, I wait beside the fruit longer than seems necessary. When it begins to darken, I put my hands near it, not touching. Sometimes the rot pauses or pulls back. Sometimes not. I cannot always succeed. The circle shifted uncomfortably. Another elder, Raiko, muttered, listening will not feed us. But Fuyuko's gaze did not leave Koharu. She listens as one listens to kin. Perhaps that is what the orchard asks of us now. Saburo shook his head. Kin do not devour their own. The words stung, and Koharu could not help but glance at her grandmother. Fuyuko's expression tightened, but she said nothing. The meeting dissolved soon after, with no decisions made. As they left, the elders' faces were etched with doubt, their footsteps muffled by the rain. Later that night, when the lamps had been extinguished, Koharu sat alone in her room, unable to sleep. The orchard pulled at her like a low hum in her chest. She rose, dressed in silence, and walked barefoot down the soaked path toward the trees. The rain had softened to a mist. The orchard was a shadowed ocean of branches, leaves trembling under droplets. She wove her way between trunks until she found the tree she had been tending most carefully, one of the younger ones. Still pliant, its fruit pale and veined with faint light. Two fruits dangled there, their skins nearly translucent. They pulsed faintly, as if with breath. Koharu held her hands close. She closed her eyes. At first, there was only the sound of water dripping from leaf to leaf. Then, slowly, a murmur rose within her, indistinct but insistent, like voices heard through walls. She tried to focus, her heartbeat quickening. The voices seemed tangled, fragments of memory overlapping. She caught flashes. A woman laughing as she carried a child through a field, an old man sharpening a blade in the sun, a boy running with a wooden toy clutched tight. Lives braided together, fading before she could hold them. Her breath shook. "I can't save you all," she whispered. The fruit trembled. For a moment, the rot that had begun to creep across their skins stilled. And then, faintly, a voice clear enough to sting. "We never asked you to." Koharu's eyes flew open. She staggered back, her breath catching. The fruits swung gently in the damp air, their glow softening. She did not know whether the orchard had spoken or whether exhaustion had blurred her senses, yet the words stayed in her like an ember, glowing painfully. The following morning, Fuyuko found her kneeling near the same tree, her clothes damp with dew, her hair tangled. "You've been here all night." Koharu looked up, her throat raw. "Grandmother." It spoke. Or I thought it did. Fuyuko knelt beside her, hands stiff with age. "What did it say?" "That they never asked me to save them. That's all." Her grandmother studied her for a long moment. Then she said softly, "Perhaps we have mistaken the orchard's role. Perhaps it was never meant to hold everything forever." The words shook Koharu more than the night's vision. She stared at her grandmother, struggling to reconcile the certainty of tradition with the possibility of release. But before she could answer, footsteps approached along the path. Saburo appeared again, his face shadowed with urgency. "There is talk in the village," he said. "Some wish to cut the youngest trees and burn them to stop the sickness from spreading. They will come tonight." Koharu rose to her feet, her pulse hammering. If they burn the trees, the memories within them will vanish. Saburo's jaw clenched. "They say better that than losing the whole orchard. Decide where your loyalty lies, Koharu with the past, or with the living." His words hung in the wet air, heavier than the rain. Koharu felt the orchard all around her, silent, waiting. She realized then that her choices would no longer concern only her own hands and heart. The town had shifted. The bargain between generations was breaking, and she stood in its fracture line. Chapter 11. The Night of Torches. The air that evening carried a heaviness unlike any she had known. The rain had finally broken, but the sky remained mottled with clouds, as if the storm lingered somewhere just beyond sight. Koharu walked the orchard paths with bare feet, her shawl drawn close, and tried to quiet the dread pooling in her chest. It was not only the orchard that breathed unease. From the town below came faint sounds, hammering, wood being dragged, voices raised in muted determination. She had no need to see it to know what was happening. The villagers were gathering tools, preparing kindling, shaping their fear into action. Her grandmother sat at the veranda when Koharu returned. A small brazier glowed beside her, casting Fuyuko's lined face in flickering relief. "They will come," her grandmother said without preamble. "Saburo is not one to wait once he has decided." Koharu sat, her hands trembling despite the warmth of the coals. "Do you think they can be stopped?" Fuyuko's eyes remained fixed on the orchard's shadowed silhouette. "Stopped? Perhaps, but their fear will not vanish with a word. Fear is like root rot, hidden until the tree begins to die. Koharu closed her eyes. She still heard that voice from the fruit. We never asked you to. The words had tangled themselves around her heart. Were they a release, a warning, or simply her own exhaustion echoing back? As the first lantern lights flickered along the lower paths, Koharu stood. If they come for the trees, I will not let them burn them. Her grandmother's gaze turned toward her at last. Then you must be ready to pay the cost of standing against your own people. They came as shadows carrying fire. A procession of figures rose from the misted slope, torches raised, their light bending against the branches. The orchard, usually so hushed at night, seemed to draw back, the leaves shivering as though listening. Saburo led them, his tall frame unmistakable. His torch spat and hissed in the damp air. Behind him trailed men and women Koharu had known all her life, those who had shared meals with her family, mended her fences, borrowed salt in leaner winters. Their faces were tense, drawn with something between sorrow and resolve. When they reached the clearing near the younger trees, Koharu stepped forward, blocking their way. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. You cannot burn them, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The crowd hesitated. Some lowered their eyes, but Saburo held his torch high. Stand aside, Koharu. We do this for the good of all. If the sickness spreads unchecked, there will be nothing left for any of us. The memories within these trees will be lost forever, she said. You would silence generations without even asking if that is what they want. Saburo's eyes flashed. What use are memories if the living cannot eat? What good is tradition if it dooms the children it was meant to guide? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded at his words. Others shifted uneasily, looking toward Koharu with uncertainty. She raised her hands, palms open, as if to shield the orchard with her body alone. Last night I heard them. The orchard spoke. It does not ask to be saved. It does not ask to be destroyed. It asks to be remembered as it is, not as we would force it to be. The murmurs deepened. Someone whispered, She's lost to the trees. Another, or perhaps she hears what we refuse. Saburo stepped closer, the heat of his torch licking against the damp night. Do not twist fear into poetry, girl. The trees are sick, and sickness must be cut away. Koharu felt her knees weaken, but she forced her voice louder. Then cut me away with them, for I will not leave. The orchard stirred. A breeze slipped through the branches, though the air had been still moments before. The leaves shivered, and for an instant, faint glimmers moved across the fruit-pale lights, like memories rising to the surface. Faces flickered, half-formed, drifting like lanterns across water. The crowd gasped. Several stepped back, clutching their torches tighter. Even Saburo faltered, the fire in his hand lowering slightly. Koharu turned, her breath sharp. Do you see? They are still here. Even if the fruit rots, even if the season fails, they are not gone. To burn them is to deny that they ever were. Silence held the clearing. Only the orchard breathed, its leaves whispering in the night air. Finally, Reiko, the elder woman who had dismissed Koharu before, stepped forward. Her voice trembled. I see my brother's smile in that light. He's been gone 30 years. Others murmured agreement, voices caught between awe and grief. Saburo's jaw tightened. He lowered his torch to the damp earth, where it hissed and sputtered out. You ask us to live with risk, to trust in shadows and whispers. That is no easy bargain. Koharu's voice softened. It was never meant to be easy. Memory never is. One by one, the villagers lowered their torches. The clearing grew dim, the firelight shrinking to faint embers. No one spoke as they turned back toward the path, their footsteps muffled by wet soil. Only Saburo lingered, his face unreadable. At last, he said quietly, If you are wrong, we will lose everything. Koharu met his gaze, her chest still trembling. If I am wrong, then we will at least lose it together, with dignity. Saburo said nothing more. He dropped his torch into the mud and followed the others into the mist. When they had gone, Koharu sank to her knees. Her body shook, drained by the weight of holding herself upright against them. The orchard rustled faintly overhead. a sound almost like a sigh. Her grandmother came to her, carrying a lantern. The old woman helped her up, steadying her with a hand that trembled yet remained firm. You held them, Fuyuko whispered. Even Saburo, you held them long enough to remember. Koharu leaned against her, eyes closing. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like relief, though it was thin and fragile. Still, as they walked back through the orchard, she could not shake the sense that this was only a pause. The bargain was not yet complete, and the orchard was not done asking. Chapter 12. The Orchard's Answer. The days following the night of torches unfolded with an uneasy quiet, like the pause in a storm where one cannot yet tell whether the clouds will break apart or gather again with greater fury. The villagers returned to their homes, their tools set aside but not forgotten. Fires no longer burned in the orchard's shadows, yet smoke lingered in memory, and the scent of charred wood clung to Koharu's thoughts whenever she walked the paths. In the mornings, she rose early, sometimes before dawn, to check the trees. She pressed her palms near the fruit, feeling for the faint hum of life within them. Some responded to her touch, glowing a little longer, their skins resisting the spread of black veins. Others withered despite her efforts, softening into pulp, the memories within them seeping away like water into soil. Each loss was a small death, unrecorded, unmarked, but no less real for being silent. Her grandmother, Fuyuko, watched her work without comment. The old woman moved more slowly now, her joints stiff from the damp weather, but her eyes remained sharp. She often stood at the edge of the rows, her hands clasped over her cane, observing Koharu with the calm of someone who had already seen seasons turn and turn again, until each crisis blurred into another. Yet even she could not ignore the tension brewing in the village below. News came in fragments, disagreements in the square, voices raised over evening meals, neighbors who once shared rice and tea now avoiding each other's doors. Some spoke of patience, of trusting the orchard to recover as it always had. Others whispered that Saburo had been right, that waiting meant courting ruin, and that Koharu's defiance had stolen from them the only chance to protect what remained. It was into this brittle silence that Saburo himself appeared one afternoon, striding up the slope with long steps, his face set as if against a wind only he felt. Koharu met him halfway among the younger trees, her chest tightening. You should not come here with anger still upon you, she said quietly, though her voice carried across the damp air. He halted before her, his tall frame shadowing the fruit that hung between them. If I had come with anger, the orchard would already be aflame. His eyes flicked to her hands, then back. I came to see what you claim, whether the trees still breathe. Koharu stepped aside, motioning toward a branch where two fruits swayed lightly. Look for yourself. Saburo hesitated, then leaned closer. The fruits glowed faintly, veins of light pulsing as though with heartbeats. His face, lined from years of sun and labor, softened for an instant. Then the hardness returned. It is not enough, he said. Two fruits among thousands. You speak of memory as if it were endless, but how many will remain when autumn comes? A handful? A taste? Is that what you would give to our children, crumbs of remembrance, while the rest wither into nothing? Koharu's chest ached. She touched the bark of the tree gently, as if to steady herself. Perhaps we were never meant to keep it all. Perhaps memory was always meant to fade, leaving only what truly mattered. His jaw clenched. And who decides what matters? You? This orchard? The silence of decay? Before she could answer, her grandmother's voice came from behind them. Neither child nor orchard decides. Life itself does. Memory is not a ledger to be balanced, Saburo. It is a stream. You may try to dam it, but it will carve a new path all the same. Saburo turned to her, frustration flashing in his eyes. Easy words, Fuyuko, from one who has already lived most of her years, but for those of us still with children to raise, easy words will not feed them. The old woman held his gaze unflinching. And fire will not feed them either. Do not mistake destruction for nourishment. The air between them tightened, but Saburo said no more. He turned sharply, striding back down the slope, his figure soon swallowed by the mist. That night, Koharu could not sleep. She lay awake on her futon, listening to the steady drip of water from the eaves, the restless sighing of wind across the shutters. Each sound seemed to echo with the orchard's own breath, tugging at her to rise. At last she did, wrapping herself in her shawl and slipping outside. The orchard loomed silver under a break in the clouds, the moon's light trembling across wet leaves. Koharu walked barefoot among the rows, the soil cool against her skin, until she reached the heart of the grove where the oldest trees grew. Their trunks were wide and gnarled, roots twisting deep into the earth like veins. Here, the fruit was fewer, but it glowed more strongly, each sphere a lantern of memory suspended in the night. She knelt beside one tree and placed both palms against its bark. Closing her eyes, she let her breathing slow. The familiar hum rose again, but stronger here, deeper, resonant like the tolling of a distant bell. The voices came not as scattered fragments, but as a chorus, countless lives woven together, overlapping until they became almost indistinguishable. Koharu's chest tightened. "Why are you fading?" she whispered into the bark. "Why can I not hold you?" The voices swelled, then softened, folding into a single thread she could almost understand. A warmth spread through her palms, into her arms, her chest, as if the tree itself had opened a vein of truth. "We are not fading. We are becoming." Her breath caught. The words were not spoken, yet they filled her mind with the weight of meaning. She pressed her forehead to the trunk. "Becoming what?" "The soil, the root, the breath of those yet to come. Memory is not stone, to be preserved unchanged. It is seed. It must break apart to give life again." Tears stung her eyes. She thought of the villagers, desperate to keep every fruit intact, fearful of losing even one story, one face, one song. She thought of Saburo's rage, born not only of fear but of love for what he believed he must protect. Her voice cracked. "But if you all dissolve, how will we know who we were?" The orchard's answer came not as words, but as sensation, the rush of wind through leaves, the coolness of soil, the steady beat of seasons turning. She felt, rather than heard, "You will know by what remains in you, by what you choose to carry forward. Not all can be held, nor should it be." Koharu wept quietly, her tears soaking into the bark. The orchard's hum wrapped around her, not comforting exactly, but steadying, as if acknowledging her grief rather than erasing it. When she finally rose, her legs were stiff, her hands damp with sap. She looked around at the glowing fruit, and for the first time, she did not see them as treasures to be hoarded or rescued. She saw them as lanterns set upon a river, each destined to drift, to fade, yet together forming a luminous procession. The following day, she told her grandmother what she had felt. They sat together on the veranda, morning light spilling across the planks. Fuyuko listened in silence, her cane resting against her knees. When Koharu finished, her grandmother let out a long breath. "I have suspected as much. The orchard has never promised us permanence. It has only offered us passage." Koharu frowned. "But how do I make the others see? They will not accept loss so easily." Fuyuko's gaze lingered on the orchard. "You do not need to make them accept. You need only to live it, to show them that letting go is not the same as forgetting. They must see that memory can change and still endure." The words settled heavily in Koharu's chest. She thought again of Saburo's face, the lines of exhaustion and doubt. He too would need more than argument. He would need to see with his own eyes. As summer deepened, the orchard continued to waver between light and decay. The rot spread, but so too did moments of radiance fruits that glowed fiercely for a night before softening into earth, leaving behind a shimmer in the air that clung to the skin of those who passed beneath. Children who wandered the paths sometimes laughed suddenly, recalling games they had never played. Elders paused mid-step, tears springing to their eyes at the sound of voices they had thought long gone. These glimpses unsettled some, but stirred others into wonder. The village grew restless, pulled between awe and fear, between clinging and releasing. Koharu walked among them each day, speaking little but guiding where she could. She showed them how to cradle the fruit without plucking, how to listen with patience rather than demand. Some followed her, curious. Others muttered that she courted ruin. One evening, as the sky flushed with the colors of a long sunset, Saburo appeared again at the orchard's edge. His face was weary, his shoulders stooped as though he had been carrying more than firewood alone. Koharu approached him cautiously. "You came back." He nodded, eyes fixed on the glowing rose. "My daughter dreamed of her grandmother last night. She swore she could smell her hair, hear her voice. The girl has never met her, yet she wept as if remembering." Koharu's throat tightened. Then the orchard gave her what she needed. Saburo's jaw worked, unsteady, or it deceived her. "I cannot decide which frightens me more." Koharu stepped closer, her voice soft. "What if it is neither? What if it is simply memory flowing where it is needed most? Not all truth is exact, Saburo, but it can still be real." For the first time, his gaze met hers without anger. There was only fatigue and something like the faintest flicker of hope. That night, Koharu returned to the heart of the orchard alone. She knelt once more before the oldest trees, her hands pressed to the soil this time, not the bark. The earth was cool, damp with the weight of countless roots. She whispered into the ground, "If you must release, then teach me how to help them let go. Teach me how to hold what must remain." The orchard's hum rose again, softer now, almost tender. The sensation that filled her was not of words, but of images, seeds carried by wind, roots breaking through stone, blossoms falling to enrich the soil beneath. Life layered upon life, memory upon memory, not kept whole but transformed, woven into new forms. Koharu bowed low, her forehead touching the earth. For the first time since the fruit had begun to rot, she felt not only grief, but purpose. When she returned home, her grandmother was waiting, lantern in hand. "Well?" Fuyuko asked. Koharu straightened, dirt clinging to her palms. It answered, "We cannot save everything, but we can guide what remains. That will be enough." Her grandmother studied her for a long moment, then nodded, as if confirming what she had known all along. And so, as the village stirred with uncertainty and the orchard continued its quiet unraveling, Koharu prepared herself for the final harvest not to preserve, but to choose. Chapter 13. The Last Harvest. The morning of the final harvest came with a silence so unusual it carried its own weight, as though the entire valley had conspired to hush itself. No rooster crowed, no temple bell rang, no cartwheels rumbled along the dirt road. Even the cicadas, which had filled the evenings with shrill insistence, had gone still, their song replaced by the faint rustle of leaves. When Koharu stepped from the house, basket slung against her hip, she thought for a moment she was the only one awake. The town, lined in a pale wash of dawn light, seemed unpeopled, like a stage awaiting its actors. But as she walked the lane toward the orchard, she saw shadows emerge from doorways, old women in faded shawls, men carrying sickles they had long since laid aside, children clinging to parents' sleeves. They carried baskets, crates, cloth sacks patched at the seams. Their footsteps fell in rhythm, a muted procession. No one spoke. Words on that morning seemed superfluous. The orchard itself called, and they answered. Koharu felt Saburo come up beside her. His gait was slower than it had been months ago, when he had insisted she was naive to hope. His shoulders bent, not only from age, but from the heaviness of what had been witnessed in those weeks, the rot, the fights, the near abandonment of a tradition that had bound them. Yet in his eyes there was something softened, not quite belief, but no longer cynicism. "You'll lead," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Koharu wanted to protest, to insist she was no leader, only the girl who had stumbled upon the orchard's whisper. Yet no words formed. The town had already decided, and her place was not to resist it. The orchard appeared ahead, a shadowed rise against the horizon, its branches trembling in the pale wind. When they entered, Koharu felt the same tug she had felt countless times before, the subtle pulse beneath the earth, as though roots beat with a collective heart. But now it was faint, fragile, a dwindling drum. The trees, once so full that boughs bent under the weight of fruit, bore only a scattering. Golden globes shone like lanterns left behind after a festival, few but undeniable. Gasps rippled among the villagers. Some wept at the sight, not from despair, but relief that there was anything left at all. Children pointed and reached, their small hands tugged back by watchful mothers. Koharu stepped forward, her basket resting empty against her hip, and for the first time spoke aloud the thought that had crystallized in her dreams. Today we choose. Not everything can remain. Not every memory can live on in fruit, but what we carry together. Her voice trembled, yet no one questioned. The people dispersed among the trees, moving slowly, reverently. It began quietly. An elder named Rikuto approached the nearest tree, his gnarled hand hovering over a glowing fruit. He hesitated, then plucked it with a careful twist. When he pressed it to his chest, his eyes closed, and a sigh escaped him, the memory of his wife's laughter, perhaps, or the scent of pine needles after their first shared winter. He placed the fruit into his basket, lips murmuring thanks. One by one, others followed. Mothers selected fruits with trembling fingers, whispering children's names. Farmers, once dismissive, touched the bark as if greeting an ancestor. The orchard, reduced though it was, pulsed faintly with each offering taken, as though it approved their choices. Koharu walked among them, her own basket slowly filling. Each fruit she lifted shimmered differently, one humming with warmth like sunlight on rice paddies, another carrying the ache of farewells spoken too late. She could not know precisely what each contained, but her hands knew which belonged to whom. The orchard guided her, not with command, but with quiet suggestion, as if saying, "Here, this one will matter, this one will endure." At the edge of the grove, she found her grandmother, Aya, standing before a tree bare save for a single fruit. Aya's face was pale, her breath shallow, yet her eyes were steady. "It waits for me," Aya said softly. "This one has always been mine." Koharu swallowed against the lump in her throat. "Are you certain?" Her grandmother smiled. "A memory does not die when it passes on. It changes hands. Take it, Koharu. Carry it forward when I cannot." Koharu lifted the fruit, cradling it as though it were newborn. The glow seeped into her palms, into her arms, until she felt warmth reach her heart. Aya placed a hand over hers. For an instant, Koharu glimpsed not her grandmother as she was, but as she had been a girl laughing in springtime fields, hair unbound, eyes alight with defiance. Then the vision faded, leaving only Aya's lined face, softened by peace. The harvest stretched long into the day. By noon, baskets brimmed not with abundance, but with deliberate selections. No one rushed. Each choice was weighed, felt, trusted. Fewer fruits were gathered than in any season before, yet no one complained. The orchard had offered what it could, and they had answered with care. At dusk, they gathered in the clearing. The sun dipped low, staining the horizon crimson. The fruits in their baskets glowed softly, casting golden halos upon weary faces. For a moment, the townsfolk simply stood together, listening, and they realized the orchard's heartbeat was stronger now, not loud but steady, echoing through the roots beneath their feet. Saburo stepped forward. His voice broke, but he spoke nonetheless. "We have learned. It is not endless. It was never meant to be endless. What we keep, we must honor. What fades, we must release." Koharu felt the truth of it. Memory was not a vault to be guarded jealously, but a current, flowing and reshaping. To cling too tightly was to invite rot. To release even in sorrow was to allow space for the living to breathe. That night, the town shared the fruit. Each bite released fragments of lives, brief visions, sensations, voices carried back across years. Laughter erupted, tears flowed, embraces held longer than usual. Children gasped as they glimpsed grandparents they had never known. Lovers clasped hands, reliving first meetings. In that mingling of sorrow and joy, Koharu saw the orchard's purpose fulfilled not to preserve everything, but to remind them of who they were, who they had been, and who they might yet become. When her turn came, Koharu lifted the fruit her grandmother had chosen. Its glow seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. She bit into it, and for an instant the world fell away. She stood in the orchard decades ago, blossoms drifting like snow, Aya's voice calling her name with a laugh. Koharu ran through rows of trees, barefoot, wind tangling her hair, joy unfurling like a banner. The memory filled her, then softened, then remained not as a vision, but as a steady warmth within. She opened her eyes to the night. The orchard was dark, the fruit spent, yet stars filled the sky brighter than she had ever seen. Around her, the townsfolk sat in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones, holding each other alive with stories. The orchard, though diminished, breathed gently, as though relieved. In the days that followed, the town did not return to what it had been. They no longer expected endless harvests, nor did they lean wholly on the orchard for their past. Instead, they began to write, to speak, to weave their memories into songs and carvings, into lullabies and stories told by firelight. The orchard remained, still offering fruit in its time, but never again in reckless abundance. And perhaps that was its mercy to remind them that memory was not infinite, but precious. For Koharu, mornings often began in the orchard. She would walk among the trees, basket empty, simply listening. Sometimes she felt the faint pulse beneath the earth. Sometimes she heard nothing but the wind. Yet always she felt accompanied, as though those who had gone before lingered in the soil, in the roots, in the breath of leaves. On one such morning, she paused beneath a tree and closed her eyes. No fruit hung from its branches. Yet she heard her grandmother's voice, faint but clear. "Remember, Koharu, not everything, only enough." She smiled, touched the bark, and whispered back, "Enough." Then she walked on, the orchard stretching around her, quiet, imperfect, and alive. Thanks for listening. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next story.